Hello and welcome to Tea Time. I am T and the reading room is now open. And today we're going to be talking about reading, but more importantly, math. Because I teach math. And also because math is sort of like the parent function to a bunch of other economic and technological and scientific functions. It's sort of like the master science. It's inside and underneath and behind and around and all throughout just about everything we do. If there were a language that could be used to describe the human soul, it would probably be a double integral, right? Or something to do with math. If there were some sort of way to understand the most complicated problems in all the universe, it would be through math. And a lot of people don't recognize that it's a language, but it is in some way a language because the characters and the notation are invented by humans, but math is discovered like a science rather than invented like a language. The knowledge of the mathematics is discovered. And a long, long time ago, back in the Middle Ages and before, it probably looked like those crazy men were just plunking away with their internally consistent own world of numbers, and maybe whatever algebra looked like it was something satanic or something magical or whatever, or it looked like a waste of time because it seemed like there was very little value to plotting out a perfect circle, and figuring out the radius and the diameter of a perfect circle or circumference or whatever, because perfect circles aren't really observable in real world. It's always some sort of small flaw. And it probably looked like those men were introverts and maybe even a little autistic or crazy or whatever. And they had very exacting standards, and they were probably very unreasonable and unrealistic for their time and place. But in fact, somebody like Newton and Copernicus and Galileo and Pythagoras and Archimedes, we remember these names because they made great discoveries. And maybe if we didn't have the stuff that we have today, we wouldn't really put these people on such a pedestal. We wouldn't, their works wouldn't be validated and proven to be timeless or transcendental or infinite in their value so much, because it could have just been that this world of mathematics and a larger part of science was just kind of on paper in its own little world, which is, again, internally consistent but had very little application or relevance outside of that small sort of impractical and theoretical paper-based world. But now we've got the stuff, and experimental physics has proven theoretical physics, and at least in part, and experimental methods of scientists and engineers, and in particular in the way that products were developed. These are all tangible evidence that the stuff on paper was real fact, whereas the laws of the legislature and even the way that the religious people do their worshiping and the way they live changes from generation to generation, and there's no real standard through the ages. Even the most passionate of Christians and Muslims and Buddhists today is hardly even imaginable compared to those from a couple thousand years ago or 1,000 years ago. But the mathematics is going to hold true forever, because it's just the way stuff works, until it's disproven, and in which case we'll just use the scientific method, which is, it's a luxury in a way that people will be able to prove something true or false, and when it's proven false, then they can just change their beliefs, because their beliefs aren't really that per se, but they are just perceptions of reality, and the ultimate goal of the science folks is to get at the core of reality. And so I'm going to focus more on math than reading, but indeed they're all kind of tied together too in schools. And we've seen plenty of reports recently, especially since COVID. There's been an increasing focus on student performance, and it has been diminishing alongside rise in distractions with the phone since 2015, 2013 especially, as the world grabbed a hold of the handheld devices with broadband internet technology, which is really the greatest learning tool ever created, but most people don't use it that way. And unfortunately, we don't have great testing and data reporting, and much like with criminal justice statistics, different states and different districts, they report in an untimely manner and they report differently, and especially with education, the testing system is really quite different from state to state, except for the SAT, ACT. And then not everybody takes that. And those who do, show that we're kind of in a pickle here in the United States, especially as the world economy kind of gets bigger and continues to get a little bit more unmanageable from any one country's perspective. The world of the hegemonic Western world, is pretty much over, and that's a good thing for a lot of people, and it's also threatening other people's livelihoods. And so, as an intelligent animal, more or less, the best thing we can do is adapt, and that is very much not what people are doing, but rather they're kind of digging in their heels and continue to do what they have been doing for a little while and what feels good in the moment, which is not necessarily producing results in the long term. And that's leading to disruptions, and distortion and all sorts of assorted costs. Speaking of costs, the United States spends more than other developed nations on pupils in the classroom. And of course, there are going to be different estimates. Oddly enough, just like the prison population, we don't really know how much is spent to the dollar. There could be blockchain technology, and they could have a distributed ledger system where every dollar transfer that goes into every account could be accounted for at any time, but I just don't think we're at that level of concern yet, let alone whatever legal mechanism would circumvent the constant privacy concerns and territorial and jurisdictional concerns, and each fiefdom, the leader of each fiefdom wants pretty much total control, and that causes a few problems. But that spending doesn't really relate to increased performance. Now, there are a lot of reasons why the United States spends more per pupil. A lot of it has to do with the geographical distance that people have to travel in order to go to school, low population density. Now, it's comparable to Canada, but Canada's population density is largely mitigated by the proximity to the American border. Almost all of Canadians live within 50 miles of the U.S. border, or 250 miles, like very close to the U.S. border. So in the south of Canada, and mostly along that southern border of Canada. And then the Great North is pretty much unpopulated. And so the population density is misleading in that way. Population density on any island, of course, in like the UK, United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, 2 islands, I suppose, or a small chain of islands there, is, of course, the geographical reach of the places that the population could then travel to is limited, and so population density is higher. Same thing throughout mainland Europe, Germany. Finland is large, but again, way up north in the Lapland region, you're not getting too many people. France, of course, has, all of these countries, South Korea, of course, has higher population density. And so the schools have, there are fewer schools per capita, right? In the United States, you might have, certain states like Mississippi has a lot of very small schools with, where the elementary, middle, and high school kids all travel to the same place, or you might have a graduating class of like 10 or something like that. And these are not very common elsewhere. And in the United States, you can't really close those schools very often, or all the time anyway, because then that would leave people 100 miles from the nearest school, or 50, too far to travel, and with the price of gas increasing and federal busing mandated, then it just leaves the United States in a bit of a pinch where they have to spend more per capita, per person, right? And so the cost of living, the population density drive up the cost, but it is an investment, and we want to get return on investment, so that student performance drives down the return on investment, and that's the main concern when it comes to test grades. Now, 4th graders and 8th graders, you can see these graphs. You've got from 1990 to 2015, and this is really at the very start of the smartphone. And you can see a slight reduction right there from 2011, 2013, 2015. You can see a slight reduction in the number of advanced proficient and even basic students, and an increase in the number below basic, even in those first few years of the smartphone and social media, distractions where kids are making their entire identity is tied up into these online virtual systems. Whereas we had made some progress, not much if you ask me. I have a higher standard than some people, I think. But there was some progress being made of reduction of below basic in 1990 to 48% 1990 to 27% in 2011, and an increase of proficiency and advanced together from 15% in 1990 to 36%. So a doubling of those who are meeting bare basic standards. Basic in this case is like getting 40% of the test questions right or something like that, whereas advanced is probably getting an 80% or above. Proficient might be just passing, basically. So the number who passed at least was quite low in 1990, and then it had increased, but it's on the downslide, both in 4th grade and 8th grade. And there are a lot of reasons for this. One of them maybe is just complacency. The United States is basically average around the world. It had a lot of great luck in the mid-20th century, especially with attracting high-tech gurus, like Oppenheimer and those people from Europe, and it had a lot of natural competitive and comparative advantages through earlier stages in this most recent part of the Industrial Revolutions. But it has kind of settled into this middle ground where it's quite average, and the cost of living, however, is not average, and the demands on the population as far as the economy goes are not average. And so that's where responding, rational people will respond with increased investment, both of time and money, energy, into education, because there are implicit advantages. There are intrinsic benefits to just knowing stuff. What did Richard Feynman called it? The pleasure of finding things out. There's obviously some quality of life benefit of just knowing how stuff happens and how stuff works. Beyond the memorizing and regurgitating, the facts of the day, or being able to repeat what somebody else said through religions and law, actually being able to verify and sort out the physical reality through sciences, and that's probably where we are in the most recent phase of the economic expansion. Is we've got mostly high-tech sector and healthcare, and these high skill, very precision-based fields are the ones that are in high demand, and it doesn't look like there's going to be any great return to the lower skilled jobs being of significant value to individuals. Although obviously somebody's got to make the stuff, somebody's got to mine the stuff, somebody's got to clean the trash, all these things. Unfortunately, there's just no way for labor to negotiate contracts and things like that. And indeed, everybody can push a broom, whether the single men out there like to admit it or not. Everybody can clean house and make dinner, but not everybody, apparently, not everybody can, or not everybody is inclined to do complex mathematical equations, and not everybody's inclined to memorize, the redox equations and organic chemistry, and not everybody is either capable or willing to figure out, in minute detail, how the universe works. And maybe, as far as human potential goes, the vast majority of people could if they really, really tried. But there are a number of psychological and social and economic and other personal, internal, external reasons that people just don't, right? So pragmatically speaking, I think that's what a lot of people talk about when they're talking about ability. Some people just take those test scores and say that that's a measure of ability. And then there's, of course, a latent argument about, ability is, it implies something else too, rather than just demonstrating something. It implies that, people are not capable of it, no matter how hard they try. And I don't think that's necessarily true with these higher skill endeavors. But indeed, Americans are just not, they're not taking up the challenge on average, right? And when we're talking about economies and how people are doing generally, that's what we're talking about, is average, and again, the American lifestyle is not average by global standards. The people want more, and they have higher incomes, and they're producing more trash and more waste, and using more resources per person. And so this is very much not an average lifestyle by global standards, but the mental acuity, with regard to like knowing how stuff works and being able to work through things and reason through things at some sort of reasonable academic level, is more or less average, or it has been trending in that direction. And so here's one of the ways that we can test that and kind of qualify that statement, is through these PISA exams, PISA and TIMSS. PISA is the high school exam, and then TIMSS is like a 4th and 8th grade exam that compares countries internationally. And generally they focus on the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and those partners. It's like 38 countries. The PISA, I think, runs in 88 countries. So it's a pretty good measure of international competitiveness. If people are doing better in school, then they're likely to produce more patents, be more innovative in their work life later. And the innovation economy was one of these buzzwords that came out, 15 years ago or so. And maybe that's not what people are talking about. People are just harping on equity and all this type of stuff now. But the innovation economy was a really big deal not so long ago, and that's because that's what's going to pay the bills. That's what's going to make a country more competitive than others. That's what's going to ensure that we can continue on this trajectory, rather than a lot of ups and downs and cyclical depressions and it's sort of a manic disturbance in the way that the economy works. And the larger economy does affect individuals. Not every individual, not everybody equally, but trends do indeed impact the ground level too. So these education concerns are, even though they're not like on the top of the government's to-do list, they are right in the background and just kind of always happening, which can explain the turmoil and the disputes and the conflicts and things, and the chaos, the disruption that's been happening for quite a few years now. So top performers in the United States score better than international averages in reading and science, but lower than average in math. And again, reading at a high school level is not exactly something, you're not just going to go out in the working world and read, Reading tests in high school on PISA are, they're generally not like case studies, and it's not for a specific purpose. And so I don't put so much emphasis on reading, but that, it's important too. And then science, reading graphs and stuff like that is mostly what they're doing in these tests. So that's more like the visual aspect, visual representation of mathematics, but getting into the core computations and doing statistics and doing algebra, that's where patents are coming from. That's where engineering is coming from. That's where physics is coming from. That's where finance is coming from. And if Americans can't do that, then they're going to recruit from other countries, and that's what they've been doing generally. We're also on a downward trend. Year-on-year averages are down, right? And that's fairly normal across the world, but look at, for example, Singapore. Now, Singapore is a unique place because it's a city-state, population there is limited, and then they get a lot of expats too. But Japan has very, very few expats, very, very few, like almost zero naturalizations per year. So that's a homogeneous population. It's up on the upward trend, right? You can see the score difference. It's increased even through COVID. It increased after COVID. This is a 2022 exam. So from 2018 to 2022, almost, you can see a lot of these countries declined. The United States, it declined in mathematics, and let's see, how else did we do? Declined in, so we increased slightly in reading and even in science, which is good, but declining in mathematics, which, and then also, a long-term trend is up. The long-term trend for both reading and science is up. The short-term trend is down in the United States. And that that's reflected in a lot of these other countries. So more or less normal. And the United States has not declined as much as some other countries. But in mathematics, you can see a 13-point decline is quite significant. So let's just look at some more graphs and figures and try to figure out what's going on here and get some understanding of what has been happening, what is happening, and then what might happen, and how can people respond. Mathematics, reading, and science performance declined significantly since PISA began. And so, well, this was directly from the PISA, and so was this. So in general, right? So across the world, overall, reading, math, and science have significantly declined. And so then average decennial, so of which, so the United States has increased its overall reading and science compared to other countries, but there's been a significant decrease among all the countries, and so our comparative increase in science and English and reading are not necessarily they're not necessarily whole number increases. We might have actually decreased, and I haven't poured over the data that much, but our increase in English and science is relative to other countries which have been on that downward trend. You can see more or less flat from 2000 until 2012, more or less flat, and then a significant decline from 2012. And that's got to be the social media and the devices. So again, those devices are connected to the World Wide Web, which has all of the knowledge of all of the humans who have ever lived, basically, as far as we know. There are some paywalls, but generally it's all for free anymore. Web 3.0 or whatever we're on has YouTube tutorials, and there are PDFs galore. It's not 1997 where they didn't even have a PDF, and the video, it took 12 minutes for a page to load and all that. These are broadband connected high-speed devices that can stream gigabyte files and hold terabytes of information on them, and sometimes anyway, certainly connected to an external hard drive. So there's no guarantee that a device is necessarily harmful, but that's kind of what it happens to be. Here we got facts. Students who spent an hour per day learning on those digital devices outperformed those who didn't by 14 points. By 14 points. Some students reported being distracted by using digital devices in mathematics classes, like 54% in Argentina to 5% in Japan. So Japanese people are, not exactly the norm. They're, for whatever reason, culturally in particular, they're inclined to not break rules and to do what they're told and to be disciplined. And it took 1,000 years for that to happen, and obviously there were examples in their history which suggested that it wasn't always such a peaceful, quiet place, just doing what they're told or whatever. But whatever the story is from then, today, you can see that self-control probably is a big part of what's going on in Japan, which led to their increases in testing over those years, including over COVID. Now, that's 1 hour per day learning on digital devices, right? It doesn't really say anything about who spent that much time just goofing off on digital devices. And all of East Asia is famous for technology and media and video games and stuff. So it's not like people in Japan aren't using social media and playing video games a lot. It's just that they're managing their time, and they're also putting emphasis on education. And individuals are inclined to feel guilt when they do poorly on an exam, for example, because they lose face in front of the group, which does not then convert somehow to a pride, to being proud of one's failure, but rather, in fact, is more sensical, more obvious that, failure is just that. Failure is not somehow a success. Failure is failure, and that is not something to feel proud of or excuse away, but rather it's something to work on at very best, Now, I don't think we need to go to extremes, but to actually feel the pain of failure is probably a good thing, because those pains might motivate somebody not to feel failure, rather than, joining a club and acting like failure is success and success is failure, and having all these backwards and inverted sort of social perceptions, then if that's the case, then we can kind of more or less throw it all away and just get used to being middle of the pack and on the decline. But I don't think that's what people want. So education systems with more positive parental involvement saw better performance, especially among disadvantaged students. That kind of goes without saying. It all starts at home. And that's, again, not very surprising. So let's look at, this is from the National Assessment of Educational Progress in the United States. We've got mathematics score, and we could look at the reading and the math, and they are following the same trends domestically. Down, right, trending down. Our test scores are trending down, math, science, and reading. In the early 2000s, there was that No Child Left Behind Act, which required math, science, and reading tests, and then replaced by 2015's ESA, or the Education, Successful Students Act, or anyway, ESSA, which again focused on having tests, to actually compare students and make sure they're doing well, and they're not. So let's see, we've got starting in 1990, and there are different tests, but they're all, skills don't change all that much, especially not in high school. There's been a lot of development in colleges and in graduate schools, but high school math is pretty much the same. The teaching has improved, we've got more ways to represent data. There have been different techniques that allow for math and science and even reading to kind of come to life easier. And so, it's not all just sitting with a pencil and paper and scribbling calculations. It's really quite different now. So this increase overall, we've got an increase from 263 to 274. It's not even a 10% increase, but all right, it's an increase, so not terrible. 263 to 275 for males, 262 to 273 for females in general. And then you can see it's broken down into racial categories. Right, so there's been a slight increase in mathematics performance in high school until recently. And that kind of defies, that's grade 8, that's grade 8, that's why. That kind of defies what we would consider to be the norm, since we're being told the opposite from a lot of people. But let's look at high school. 150 in 2005 and 150 in 2022. For males, 151 to 152, 149 to 149 for females, and then broken down into all these different racial groups. Roughly the same. Some racial groups are increasing their performance, but we're like flat by that standard there, right? Mathematics scale score. So the same we went up and then right down, and that's the decline right there. 2005 to 2009 up, flat to 2013, and then down from 2013. So there had been gains, and if we had this grade 12 data available from 1990, we might see some gains. We have gains in the early aughts, and then around 2013, since then we're just going down again. Down, down, down. And there are a lot of reasons, of course. We hear a lot about poverty, and I think they're just using race as a corollary for poverty now, as a substitute, as a placeholder, where it can't really change what position people are born into, right? And of course, as people are experiencing violence, then they're less likely to be in the mental state required to learn something. But you can see from these graphs, this is a really robust study. It's not absolute. There's a correlation there, but it's kind of a moderate correlation. You can see a whole lot of variance above and below that regression line there. That's for both English language arts and for mathematics. And you can see mathematics, the spread is even more so, more on the lower end and more on the upper end, so less correlated to exposure to violence actually. Ages 0 to 6, now again, that's like really basic stuff. And sure, all of our knowledge builds on prior knowledge. But a lot of the studies that you'll see in education are from elementary schools and from charter schools and from private schools, and they're not replicable. There's a replication crisis in education. People trying to explain everything with a single study, it's not exactly possible. We can explain what happens in one classroom, what happens in one district, what happens with one student, and even only then, just partially. And so, to me, it ends up being kind of like the same old song and dance again, where, yeah, there are trends and there are endogenous, exogenous factors, but there are also a lot of exceptions. And in PISA 2018, they had what was called resilient students, where resilient students were able to outperform students in other groups. So a resilient student in a low socioeconomic status group was able to outperform students in higher socioeconomic status groups, showing, again, basically what this graph shows, that there's variance. Different people are different. And yeah, generally there's like kind of a cluster around the central tendency, but there's sufficient evidence to suggest that, each person has his or her own way of dealing with that environment. And a person is not necessarily bound to perform one way or another based on their environment. Basically, that people in a group might follow general patterns, but each individual in that group doesn't necessarily have any distinctive or certain cognitive ability or trait or behavioral pattern, right? That different people act and think and feel differently. That should go without saying, but that's kind of been lost in the news recently. And so, following on that violence page here, let's look at school data from the United States. Recording incidents of crime at school, again from the same NAEP government website. I had to kind of abbreviate. I took out the categories of these bottom types here. But the main trend, let's see, 1990 through over on the right, 2019, 2020. So the number of total recorded incidents, 86.4, that's going to be a rate. Percentage of public schools reporting incidents of crime at school. So 86% in 1990, 77% in 2019. Most of that is due to fewer reported incidents to sworn law enforcement. So we got 62% in 1990 down to 46%. So schools are reporting to sworn law enforcement a lot less. And that's probably because of the increase of school officers. Starting in the early 2000s, it was a rarity that a school would have a police officer. In even the early 2000s, we got 2015 here at 47. It's like a significant decline. And this is also following the Black Lives Matter movement and the arguments about criminalization of the poor and criminalization of minority segments. So we see, coincidentally, no data for those years 2013, 2014. Starting in 2015, there's far fewer cases reported to sworn law enforcement. Violent incidents, and again, all of these down below, violent incidents, larceny, theft, these are all reported to sworn law enforcement. But let's look at the other reason why we see a decline from total incidents 1999 until 2020 is theft, right? Theft is actually lower, at least reported theft. A lot of crimes and things go unreported, but reported theft, it goes from 49 to 31% of schools reporting, and then other incidents, I don't really know what that is. 72 to 56. I think that was vandalism, and knife possession, vandalism, stuff like that. Whereas if we just look at violent incidents, 71% of schools reporting violent incidents in 1999, and then 70% in 2020. So violent incidents are roughly the same. They did go up in 2003, and then kind of fell a little bit, 2013, and then back up. So there's a little bit of ebb and flow for violent incidents, serious violent incidents from 19.7 to 25.4 in 2020. And then even the year before that, 21.3 in 2017, 2018. They've actually gone up. Serious violent incidents, rape or attempted rape, from 0.7 to 1.0, and that might have to do with perceptions of what qualifies rape, and then more people are feeling comfortable reporting rape. So I don't know if that actually implies that there are more incidents. It's always a question with regard to reporting rate, and how people are qualifying incidents. Sexual assault Aldrin rate 2.5% to 5.3%. And again, a lot of this is probably due to different reporting standards over the years. Physical attack with fight or weapon, that's going to be that's straightforward. It's going to be pretty much the same. 5.2 to 8.9, so that's gone up. Robbery with threat of physical attack with a weapon, 11.1% of schools to 10.0. Robbery with a weapon, 0.5% to 0.9%. Robbery without a weapon, 5.3% to 5.7%. Physical attack or fight without a weapon, 63.7% to 59.9%, so fewer physical attacks or fights without a weapon. Threat of physical attack without a weapon, 52.2% to 40.1%. So the majority of those lower categories were reported less frequently, but serious violent incidents are accounting for the flatlining of total violent incidents, and then increase in rape, attempted rape, and sexual assault. It's hard to say whether the actual rate of the offense is increasing or if reporting is increasing with all of these, but these are the numbers. Okay, so let's look at if we're to take that at face value, that in the previous slide, violent crime decreases, exposure to violent crime has a negative correlation with student performance, then we would expect roughly the same student performance in 2020 and in later years as we did in previous years, because we've got roughly the same exposure to violent crimes. And in fact, that's what we're seeing, where we had we're the same, right? From 2005 to 2022, the same overall performance, flatlining performance, and roughly the same trend. So that pans out, like a casual inference from looking at data here. But then there are also those exceptions, and trying to figure out how to stop 1 million people from being violent is very different from trying to figure out how to get one student to remain calm and just plunk away at their calculations or their reading or something like that, and then do that 1 million times because we got 1 million students or more. So graduation rate is up, which is good, but proficiency is actually down, which implies grade inflation is up and the standards are down. Proficiency is down again, depending on the measure, and it's down from the earlier 2000s. It's up generally from 1990 and down from not so long ago. So we got percent of people who are graduating from 78.4% in 1991 to 91.2% in 2022. That's a pretty significant increase. And it happened across all racial groups. Hispanics jumped up 24%, blacks jumped up 24%, whites up 14%, Asian Pacific Islanders up 6%, American Indian Alaska Natives up 12%, 2 or more races up 8%. So everybody's graduating more often. Graduation is good, but if we're graduating far more people and proficiencies like flat or down, especially in these middle years, there's growth all through those years. So proficiency had gone up in this period and graduation up, but in this period, proficiency is down and graduation is still up significantly. And so that implies grade inflation is up and standards are down. And there are a lot of reasons for that. One of them is schools need to keep their federal funding, and the more students they have enrolled, the more money they get, and schools need every dollar they can, since the money is spent elsewhere. We don't tax billionaires and they spend trillions of dollars on bombs that just blow up, and they got to rebuild the thing that it blew up. So it's not exactly a responsible usage of finance and capital resources, if you ask me, but that's the way it is. So schools have adapted and just tried to keep every dollar they can. But one of the results is a failure. We got more people in schools because graduation is up, so they're retaining more. And then violent incidents, the number of schools reporting violent incidents is still the same, which suggests there are probably maybe even more violent incidents total, because if it's the same per capita and there's more capita, then the total is, there's a good chance that it's actually more violent in schools. And that's what the viral videos and a lot of the teacher testimonials are telling us nowadays too. That maybe school shootings are just like a symptom of a bigger problem. And maybe school shootings yielding multiple casualties nowadays are just the next episode in back in the 90s. You know, it was pretty famous. I had a friend's brother who had a summer home in Jackson, Michigan, you know, over there at the penitentiary. That was his vacation spot. And he used to talk about kids at their Detroit high school bringing in guns and shooting up the school and stuff, or just outside the school gates or something like that. So maybe recent trends are just reflection and expansion of previous trends. Dropouts, look at it, dropouts. Mostly, if they're dropping out, they're employed less nowadays than they used to be before. They're not even seeking employment, and so they're not in the labor force. Dropouts are down, which is good, right? However, keeping them in school and having them not do much is not exactly, it's not helping everybody. I guess it's helping somebody somehow. But overall, it's probably a big part of this flat falling performance and then rising graduation rates. Sure, you know, if a job absolutely requires that high school diploma, then the person who has a high school diploma gets a benefit. But maybe the company who gets the person who has a high school diploma but not the skills that they expected from a high school diploma, you know, maybe that company sees a disadvantage and has to then spend how much more training that person because the school didn't do so or kick the person out. But then if you kick the person out and they're dropping out, or, you know, we can probably infer that being expelled and dropouts follow similar patterns. And, you know, maybe they're doing other stuff. They're not employed, they're not seeking employment, and maybe they go commit crimes, right? So there's all these balancing acts and stuff. Speaking of Detroit, I like to pick on Detroit because it's easy to pick on Detroit. And so here we have the Detroit Public School Community District. And it's following pretty much the same national trends. So if we look at aggregate statistics and then individual districts, we're seeing very, very similar patterns where since 2013, performance on the SAT is flat and down. The Michigan Department of Education tests, they have M-STEM and MI access, and they had MEET before and MM or someone. They got a bunch of different tests coming year by year, but they don't even test at the state level. They don't even test math and reading. They only test science and social studies, or maybe even just social studies recently, whereas the SAT in this college readiness category is the only way to measure math and evidence-based reading, like more technical stuff, you know. And that's what's going to be comparable across state lines too, whereas each state under the ESA has full liberty and discretion to come up with their own testing system. You know, one state might use algebra from 9th grade or 10th grade, and then the other state's going to use SAT to report statistics on math, and then those performances are very different because SAT includes algebra, but that's only part of what SAT includes, and so on. So states' performances are hardly comparable, which makes it puts the admissions board for colleges in a real heck of a spot. Because if, you know, not too long ago, if they get rid of the SAT, ACT, and they're just using, you know, if they're assessing out-of-state applicants and they're just using grade point average and state testing and an admissions essay to decide if, you know, if the person can handle whatever rigorous curriculum some universities have, then they're put at a disadvantage because states aren't really directly comparable. But the SAT is a nationwide exam and even an international exam in some cases, and so it provides robust data, right? And you can see it's flat and falling, right? They're not doing well. And I think the average in the Detroit Public School District is like 800 something, which is bad. It's really bad. And I think the default is to say it's the teachers who are not teaching. There's probably some of that. But students take the test, teachers don't take the test. And if teachers took the test, they'd probably do better than 800, I can tell you that much. So students even just did what their teachers are doing. Teachers must know something. They got bachelor's degrees and they got certified, they're gonna take tests. And so if the students would even be at whatever range of mediocre teachers might fall in, if they were, students would be improving if they did just as well as teachers did. So I find it hard to believe that it's just all teachers' fault. When a teacher might spend 1 hour at a time for 5 days a week in a classroom with 30 students or 25 students or 20 students or whatever, and how many minutes per student is that? Very low. And if they're distracted by their phones and doing everything they can not to pay attention to the teacher, well then I'm going to have to put most all of that, like 95% on the student, because they're the ones taking the test. It's their future. According to Data Driven Detroit, Michigan State University's Education Policy Center found 32% of the DPS class of 2006 graduated in 4 year, 32%. So Detroit Public Schools is really famous for having the lowest graduation rate in the country for quite a few years there. And they have increased the graduation rate to like 80-some%. I had a friend who was working in Detroit, and I kind of made fun of him while I was working in Thailand, and he was so proud of working on Detroit Public Schools graduation rate improvement program, and I just didn't understand what the heck was going on. I thought it was that this was a lost cause, basically, that they were going to try to improve this rate of graduation by so much in Detroit, when I didn't take into account that under the No Child, and especially under the ESA system after 2015, that states can basically do whatever they want. They can pass any student they want with almost no skills, just to keep them enrolled to get that money. I did not take that into consideration. I thought that graduating more students meant that each of the students who graduated had to pass some minimum qualifications rather than just have their name on a roster. So he was right and I was wrong, but in this other way I was kind of right too. Where it's laughable that in this range from 2013 to 2023, Detroit Public Schools has increased its graduation rate by quite a bit. But you can see SAT performance, college readiness is the same or worse in each of these categories. And so that leads to these common deductions or conclusions that, like this guy, Gary Nayert from the Great Lakes Education Project says, we are graduating kids who are illiterate and who can't read their diploma. That's an interesting one. And I saw an LA Times article about Gen A is the next one, and just calling them feral, illiterate, and something else. That's true. They speak in text language and can't use proper grammar ever. And they can read a stop sign. They can read some sign on the street. They can't write a paper, can't hardly fill out an application, can't pay attention to stuff for long enough to read something. So the graduation rate alone is not as important as if we were adequately preparing students for college or careers. But again, students have to want to do stuff. So here is the trade-off, that schools are going to get less money, and then they will not be able to recruit teachers who are qualified. They will not be able to purchase things for their buildings if they don't have money, and they will not be able to make repairs to their buildings if they don't have money. On the other hand, in order to get that money, they have to keep students in schools who do not want to be there, who are trying to cause fights, and who are as violent as ever, if not more so, who are even less interested in the academic part of school than they used to be, at least than they were not so long, in this lifetime for most of them, for every student in high school, it's been within their lifetime that the academic performance has decreased. And so what we're looking at then is a cultural problem. When an individual does poorly, that is just one person, and it does not reflect upon a culture, And if the culture is going in one direction and individuals go in another, then they are a subculture or a niche, or they are an exception, or in some cases outlier. But when the whole culture seems to be going in one direction, and that's like average to less than average, especially in math, then it's an outlier or an exception that somebody does well. And that's where we have macroeconomic and social problems, which, surprise, 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 that's what we have now, where there are people who are talking about civil war today and, or next year, and there are people who are, you name it, we've got that problem in the United States, which was not present so much not so long ago. I mean, at least in the 90s, there was a period of more or less pretty decent improvement across the board. And whatever, maybe good things don't last. Maybe that's it. But let's take a look at cultural values in different countries. And I think it's no surprise that the cultural values in the East, in East Asia, they're pretty famous for doing math. And there's a whole bunch of false beliefs out there about, about the average East Asian. I've worked in East Asia, and when I was there, I said to myself more than once that I would put my Thai students and my Chinese students up against my high school students from my high school in Farmington, Michigan, any day of the week. And what I didn't realize is that the high school I went to was among the top performing in the country, and the students I went to school with were performing much, much better than average, right? We're absolutely not average at Farmington High School. And so I still believe that like my graduating class is comparable to any of these private schools around the world, but the average graduating class across the country is just not in that same batch. We were probably plus 3 standard deviations to the right of the mean. And what we're looking at here is a big beefy part of the normal curve, where this is from the PISA again, bunch of graphs and tables and charts. Level 1, 2, 3, 4, the blue is the level 1 or below in PISA. The 2 is a level 2, 3 is the level 3, the orange is the level 2, the gray is the level 3, and the yellow is the level 4. This is from all ages from 25 to 65 in the whole country. You can see the largest group in the United States is level 2. And then just behind that, just barely behind that, is level 1 or below. You can see that Singapore has similar level 1 and below, similar numbers, level 1 below, and then fewer level 2s, more level 1. Level 1 or below is the blue, the gray is level 3. You can see Singapore has more level 1 or below, fewer level 2, about as many level 3, and roughly the same level 4 in the whole population. But, people who are 65, 60, 50 in Singapore didn't see the big changes that came in the 90s and early 2000s. Let's look at Korea. Korea is one of the highest performing countries in the world economically, and just like Singapore, they turned it around rather quickly. Korea has a fewer than America on level 1 or below, greater than America on level 2, greater than America on level 3, this is the whole population, and fewer in level 4. Estonia is a small country. It's not very economically prosperous, but it's doing really well in education, right? And this happens, education and wealth aren't necessarily related at the national level, but certainly for individuals. And so there's like an element of national pride and cultural pride. And again, the joy of knowing things, the pleasure of just finding stuff out. There's intrinsic values. Let's just compare level 4s. Level 4s in the United States are about comparable to USA, greater than Korea, about the same as Estonia, fewer than Netherlands, slightly fewer than Canada, much fewer than Sweden or Japan. And then let's look at level 1, the blues. The level 1 or below in the USA, fewer than Singapore, as strange as that might sound, because Singapore is the #1 most competitive country in the world in terms of academics and even economics. But it's a small country, it's a city-state, it's limited population, there's a whole bunch of factors there, a lot of expats. The blue in the US is level 1 or below, greater than Korea, greater than Estonia, greater than Netherlands, greater than Canada, greater than all but Singapore. And Singapore has increased population through selective immigration quite a bit recently. So that greater portion of level 1 or below in Singapore probably relates to older populations and then population density in certain age groups. So you can see that's the whole population. Now let's look at high school completion, those who completed high school. We would expect fewer level 4s than all of the other levels. We would expect maybe, so level 2, that's understandable, that they're going to be, the average high school graduate learns something in math, but not that much, and then we wouldn't expect high school graduates to be at the very lowest level, but indeed, that's what it is. And so you can see, compared to the whole population though, the number of level 1 or belows is greater among high school graduates. So the high school graduates, the young folks, are actually bringing down the average because they are, on average, the young folks, the high school graduates, have fewer mathematical skills than the population as a whole, which I guess makes sense because people learn through experience too. Numeracy proficiency. We are a proud innumerate culture though. So high school level 4s, slightly greater than Singapore, level 3s, slightly greater than Singapore. Again, that's got to do with a lot of different population demographics in Singapore. Korea, slightly fewer level 4s, much greater level 3s at high school level, much fewer level 1s at high school level. And you can see so people who graduate high school in Korea are at least getting to level 2. That's the main takeaway there. In Estonia, again, same thing, much fewer level 1 and below. So people graduate in all of these other countries, all of the other countries except for Singapore. And that's got to do, again, with local and domestic and expat population, a lot of different demographic factors. But all of these other countries, Korea is homogeneous, Estonia is mostly homogeneous, Canada is more pluralistic and multiracial, Netherlands is quite multiracial, similar to the United States, Japan is homogeneous. And so there are demographic, groups on average perform differently. Individuals in those groups perform differently compared to their peers, but since we're inundated with racial and demographic statistics, the United States is not comparable to any other country, but to some extent, at scale, like to a slight degree. There are differences in degree and kind. So Korea is a different kind of country. Canada is a different degree, and Netherlands is a different degree. So we should expect at scale that the United States would more resemble something like Netherlands or Canada after high school. And although we're all people, I think there are enough people who think along racial lines that they might not expect, Koreans and Japanese to perform similar to the United States just because they're more homogeneous and the United States is more heterogeneous, although, again, that shouldn't be the go-to, but whatever. People in all of these other countries are more likely to get to level 2 or higher than Americans after high school. More Americans fail to get to level 1 in terms of numeracy with high school. And then let's look at bachelor's degree or higher. Now, we would expect, since the United States is what we call the wealthiest country, now most of that wealth is from multinationals who are headquartered in the United States but sell more than half of their goods and services worldwide, so, it just depends on who's calculating and how. But we would expect, in such a wealthy country where the financial system is so robust, so big, and there are so many patents, and there is such widespread consumer adoption of technology, and that American bachelor's and graduate degrees are still conferred upon how many different foreign students, and we still like to think ourselves the leaders in this and that and the other. We would expect that numeracy among bachelor's degree holders or higher in the United States would be better. I would expect that it would be better. But in fact, fewer American college graduates get to level 4 than any of these countries except for Korea. And that is slightly surprising too, because we might think of Korea as the prototypical East Asian country where everybody's great at math. And that's just a stereotype. That's no more fair than to say that every American drives a truck and has a gun rack in the back window of that truck and so on. But you can see that the number who get to level 3 in Korea is much greater. So if we add up level 3 and 4, then it's roughly the same as the United States. And so Korean university, it's probably degree choice, that those who do very well in math in Korea are going into those majors. And then also it could be a little bit of brain drain, where the best talent from the world often expatriates to the Western world. And so that could be a little bit of brain drain there. You can see in Singapore, that number who get to level 4 is huge among college graduates. And level 4 and 3 combined is, I don't know, that's 4/5 of the pie. In the Netherlands, again, in Netherlands, Singapore, Canada, Sweden, Japan, and Estonia, far more get to level 4 after college, and especially in Japan, look at that. The number who get out of college at level 1 or below is extremely small in Japan. And among these nations, USA and Canada have the highest number of college graduates who don't even get to level 1 or just barely get to level 1 or below. And I think that's where we see a lot of these funny, blank studies and liberal arts and graphic arts, and who are journalists who, control the conversation. People who are all about words and not about numbers at all, and they might know how to write, but they often write about proportions and rates and things like that when they shouldn't be. And that's where we see probably a lot of the conversation just going off the rails, where they're not getting simple mathematical skills even through college. And compare that to Japan, tiny fraction. Compare that to Korea, tiny fraction get out of college. Netherlands, tiny fraction get out of college without developing basic numeracy skills, right? So main story here is that our high school graduates almost never get to level 3 or 4. They're very often stuck in level 1. And then our college graduates get to level 4 less often than other countries, and they're far more often stuck in level 1 or below. Right? So that's an outcome that people aren't going to like very much. And here's where those pie graphs came from. This table here, where you can see the United States has greater than, it's kind of an outlier among the OECD, and it's definitely an outlier among wealthy countries. So it lags in level 4 attainment, it leads in level 1 or less. Right? It only slightly exceeds the OECD average in level 2 or 3 at any level of education. It slightly exceeds the OECD average in attaining level 1, level 2 in high school. And then it slightly exceeds the OECD average of attaining level 1, 2, or 3 in high school. And that level 1 is confusing because it's level 1 or below. But on average, we can see the United States is it's the most underperforming in mathematics. And again, that's going to relate to money. Whether we like it or not, the foreigners can't do all the jobs and then somehow give everybody who doesn't have time to sit and do something complicated a big part of their wealth. And that's just not how the world works. And it's good to get to know that in younger ages, because getting to know that in older ages is not going to lead to being able to utilize that knowledge so much. One of the main reasons that we're not learning, and not learning math especially, is because it takes a lot of time. And then if students are absent, 1 in 7 students in 2016, growing to 1 in 6 in 2017, back down to roughly 1 in 4 in 2018, 1 in 8 in 2018. So 2018, 2019 was actually the best year, and this is Mississippi, in the bunch for absentee rates, whereas it grew to 1 in 4 by 2023, even after COVID. In the year of COVID, 1 in 5 were chronically absent, which is minimum 18 days per year missed. And you can see on this graph, this is Mississippi, and it's more or less average, slightly below average on a lot of things and slightly above on other things. But we can assume that these are the rates that we're talking about. I've read news articles that suggest this is a common theme across the country, where there's like 2 out of 5 12th graders who are chronically absent, missing 18 days per year, or there are 1 out of 3 11th graders who are chronically absent in this most recent year. Increasing rates in higher grades, and this is when they take their SAT. So the SAT scores are going to be flat and low when students, they'll show up for that 4th grade test, right? They're going to school because they can't be home alone. And when they skip, what are they going to do? They're going to sit and watch television, then mom and dad can get the police called on them. And they'll show up for the 8th grade, even though less often. They're showing up for class in elementary school, which means they're going to perform better on their 4th grade tests. They're showing up a little bit less often, but still showing up in middle school, which means they're going to perform better on those 8th grade tests compared to high school exit exams, which, maybe 3 out of 5 showed up for class, 4 days a week, whereas, 2 out of 5 didn't show up for class 1 to 2 days out of the week, right? In Mississippi, the low for absenteeism in a district was 10% and the high was 40%. The low for a school was 5% and the high was 55%. So there's a lot of range in there, and I assume that the number of days missed, there's a whole lot of range there too. And of course, that is related to grade point average and then test scores, or learning. Test isn't the only thing going on, and it's not like the singular measure of somebody's intelligence or what they're capable of or what everything they know, but it's a good measure, especially when compared against all these other things. And if they're not going, not learning. This one is in GCSE, that's going to be British standard, but the same goes for pretty much everywhere. And that's where we get chronic absenteeism. Notice the sharp increase if they show up to even 90% of classes. So if they're not chronically absent, if they don't miss 10% of the days, then it's almost negligible, the benefit of, it's not negligible, there's a slight increase, but it's not so significant how much lower their grade point is or how much lower their learning is compared to those who show up every day, right? There's only a slight increase between 90% of tech classes, 90 to 95% of classes attended versus 100%, but there's a very big, there's a big slope here, there's a big gradient here, whereas you can see if they're missing less than 90%, then they just can't possibly get all those points because they're not in class, and those points aren't just some teacher's favoritism, that's the learning. And so that cross-reference across different sources, of course, time in the classroom and time on task and time in front of a teacher, not just on a device, trying to learn independently, especially in younger ages, results in more learning, right? And there's some sort of diminishing returns at some level, but studies are suggesting anyway, there's reason to believe that 90% threshold is really important. That's the bare minimum. That enters the zone of like proximal learning or something. And that's why we see the U.S. Department of Education and others focus on that 90% level. And that's reasonable. Missing 18 days in a year is a lot of days. It's a lot of days. And then that results in fewer enrollments at the university level. If they're not going to high school, they're not going to go to college. You can see declining enrollments. I mean, some of this might have just been somebody who was going to choose some degree that was going to cost a whole lot of money and not produce any returns on the back end. But declining enrollments are also largely due to the males not enrolling in college more often. The female population and the ratio of females and males in colleges now is something like, it's approaching 65% female. Which for frat guys, I suppose, is a plus, but for a whole economy, that's going to lead to lower earning potential among those males, who are still the main salary earners in households where there are two parents in a household. I mean, there's a whole bunch of factors there, but it does not lead to good results at scale when there are declining enrollments generally in universities, especially since the economy, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have just any old bachelor's degree to get a job, but there are skills being developed in at least some of those bachelor's degree programs. And so maybe some of this is just temporary where people had to rethink if they're going to college, what are they going for? But anyway, spin it. Fewer hours in classrooms plus low participation in STEM education equals a failure to adapt to the changing economic environment. We see in other countries, their college enrollments are more concentrated in STEM degrees, which is where the money is, which is where they're going to get return on investment, which is where the economic and the social benefit is, in developing and manufacturing and coming up with different methods and doing science. That's not only where the money is, but that's where the biggest value added is in those degree programs. And so Malaysia, Tunisia, UAE, Germany. Germans are famous for engineering. BY, what's that one? BY. I don't know what that one is. India, Korea, Great Britain, right? The US is between Great Britain and Brazil on this chart here, where we've got less than 1 in 5 American students who go to college go for a STEM degree, compared to international students. These are, at Michigan Tech, we had a small campus and a whole lot of Chinese and Indian students, especially a whole lot of Chinese students. And that's because it was a very good value for a pretty decent engineering education, okay? And these countries are, we call them some of them we call centrally planned, or they have more or less central planning features compared to the United States, where, people are just very proudly individualistic. But then again, are they really individuals when all those individuals are doing the same thing? Maybe these people are individualistic because in a huge population of 1.3 billion people in India, these students are going to do something that's incredibly difficult, which puts them far apart from the crowd. When most people gravitate around the norm, the people who go into STEM fields are not the norm. They are +3 standard deviations from the mean. And so these are individuals. These are people who are thinking for themselves. And it takes a lot of parent advice and takes a lot of culture to direct people toward going into STEM fields. But you can see those purple countries have led to the large increase in student visas issued in the United States, because more than half of the students from these countries are pursuing STEM degrees. And why are they pursuing STEM degrees? Well, probably because STEM degrees, I'll get there in a moment, STEM degrees lead to higher incomes, right? About half of graduate diplomas in the United States go to foreign students who are awarded STEM degrees, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, or medicine. And that, if half of the graduate degrees in STEM are awarded to foreigners, or sometimes over half, then that means proportionally fewer Americans are getting those degrees. And those people can either try to get an H-1B visa and stay, but there are limited numbers of those, so they usually can't stay. Most of them are going to go back home. Americans can snipe or poach foreign talent and keep itself competitive, but obviously that's not working because the domestic population hasn't really picked up the initiative to go into high-performing programs of study, to get jobs that are hard. Now, whereas everybody knows that there weren't enough doctors during COVID, the Americans still don't want to be doctors. Everybody knows that there are job opportunities for engineers and computer scientists, but people don't want to be computer scientists. They want to be graphic artists. They want to be athletes. They want to be truck drivers. They want to be welders. They want to be something that's not terribly hard. They don't mind working, sorta. They just don't want to work mentally. That's the takeaway. They don't want to think, and they don't want to do stuff that's hard mentally. Maybe it's a confidence issue. Maybe a lot of Americans really can't do these jobs. I think more could, but we have a culture that from a young age devalues education compared to like China. Chinese people go to school after school. Japanese people go to school after school, and they don't act like it's an injustice. If we had cram schools in the United States, it would be some kind of crazy injustice according to all these different campaigners. But maybe that's really what people need to do in order to live a very productive and a high income life in this year, not just in 1982 or something like that, where people could learn the bare minimum and just work hard and get away with it, and basically spend all their free time overeating, watching television, getting drunk, and doing stupid junk. Maybe this is how we spend our time, and maybe the larger problems in the economy, the flat wage growth, is at least in part due to just not adapting, not being an intelligent being as a people. Individuals make mistakes, but as a people, this declining competitiveness suggests a lot of people are making mistakes. And that mistake is devaluing education. And that happens across the board. Policy-wise, they don't fund education. Now, buildings are more expensive to build, they're more expensive to take care of, the costs are rising, the market demands for highly skilled workers is increasing the cost of equipment, personnel at schools. You know, all teachers are paid the same, but who is the math teacher or the arts teacher helping build a smarter, stronger, more productive society? Well, obviously the math teacher is, obviously the science teacher is, but they're all paid at the same rate. You know, schools can't afford to buy all of these computers and equipment and keep them working and operating well through the years if their inflation-adjusted level has been, level of funding has been roughly the same for 15 years. You know, whereas in that same time, how much more expensive is the average, you know, just day-to-day stuff? Obviously quite a bit. And not only is inflation to blame for that, but stuff is we're just using more technical devices. We need more equipment now than we did 10, 15 years ago. We need more cutting edge stuff now than we did 15 years ago because the growth is exponential. It's not just linear, and it just doesn't it doesn't just follow the trends of inflation. And then we can see as student revenues increase, student learning increases to some point of marginal diminishing returns, but I think that maybe some districts have reached that capacity, that maximum optimization for revenues and student returns, but a lot of districts are woefully underfunded, and there's just no evidence to suggest that there's diminishing returns across the board in all cases. You know, that's a really lazy statistical approach. Whereas obviously, you know, teacher pay and building maintenance and technology investment and facilities investment could be, you know, tripled basically next year, and I still don't think we would reach the diminishing returns. So this graph basically shows the same, roughly the same as the first graph there, that inflation adjusted, there's hardly been, adjusting for inflation, there's been almost no growth in funding, but they need more stuff. There's just more stuff available. You know, there are new inventions and there's more stuff available. So there are new purchase categories. There's not just the same purchases at a different inflated rate, but there are new purchase categories for schools. And the idea that somebody who's not trained in math can go into a high school math class and get somebody prepared for the ICT is just a little bit naive. You know, they can prepare somewhat, but they're going to need more skilled professionals, and they're going to need better management practices, and they're going to need more equipment, new categories of purchases and investments compared to 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago. And that's going to lead to our competitiveness. So our innovation ranking is declining. You know, our share of global R&D expenditures is going to fall as other countries like China rise out of more or less nowhere. 1995 China, you know, under Deng Xiaoping, was just starting to open up to market forces, you know, or communism of Chinese principles, or whatever they call it. Obviously, the United States' share of R&D spending is going to decrease, but also it doesn't have to. You know, as the economy grows, the United States could still be a hub or a leader in technology, but I think what we're seeing is that Shanghai, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, these are the places, rather than San Francisco's and New York's, these other places, these foreign countries and these foreign jurisdictions are the places where investment is going to be propelling the world into the future, you know, whereas New York it's too corrupt, you know. They travel on the subway in New York City or San Francisco, and then travel on the subway in Beijing or Shanghai. It's a completely different world. There's a different cultural value. And that could be something that the United States could work on, but, you know, they're too wrapped up in taking the money and run, more or less, you know. And public investment in scientific research is not exactly keeping pace in the United States as it is in other countries. And a big consequence is that the workforce is not really prepared to handle the economic shocks that are on the horizon, you know, where if people were rational actors in teenage years and deciding what they want to do for their whole lifetime, with all of these inputs, and if adolescents were famous for making good decisions, and if they could carry all these factors in mind and then make strategic decisions based on facts, well, that'd be a different story. And they would come into, they'd have to consider that STEM careers are not only growing the most, but also already pay the most. They're unemployed the least. And that college is still a good idea, because if somebody doesn't go to college, they're more likely to be unemployed still, and they're less likely to have a high income career. Whereas, the odd high school graduate or college dropout succeeds, but it's a far outlier, right? And so individuals choose to make decisions very early on in life when they're not prepared to make such long-term decisions, when they don't have all the facts, when their peer pressures are telling them anything but be responsible and think about the future. And then those individuals at scale lumped together become a country or an economy, which is on the downward slide, or at least flat, mediocre, middling at best. And that is cause for concern among a lot of people. Nobody in the United States who speaks vocally about their patriotism also likes to think of themselves as average, or their country as average, but in fact that's very much what it is and where it's going. Maybe they have the highest body count for military, or the most the most prisoners incarcerated, but they can recruit foreign talent and basically ride on the backs of people from overseas who grew up in cultural environments that value education and value STEM and understand the value of science, which Americans did in the 1900s at some point. There was, in fact, a cultural value of scientific exploration. Why else would we go to the moon? Not just compete with Russia or Soviets. I mean, it was certainly a big part of that, but it was also because of the inherent intrinsic value of, the pleasure of figuring stuff out, the value of just knowing things. Because understanding how the world works and how the physical world works, rather than how a bunch of laws are made from bills into, statutes and shuffling paper, and who needs to be bribed for this permit to come through quicker, instead of being focused solely on what the majority think is the reality for the day, and then that might change tomorrow, figuring out something that's timeless and eternal, like how the actual physical universe works, to the nano level, at the macro level. These things translate into actual individual and collective successes, right? And unfortunately, that has just kind of escaped a lot of people. And so the turnaround then is to either issue way more H-1B visas and just let more highly skilled workers fill the jobs that need to be filled, because Americans, we hear about how Americans won't do farm labor. It's because they don't want to do farm labor and shovel poop and all that in terrible conditions for $7 an hour. It really is a matter of, it's because they don't want to. So we've had, on both ends of the scale, we've got a worker shortage. And there are a couple ways about this. Obviously, a lot of American births did not happen because of abortions, and so the population is just lower than what it would have been naturally. And so then we've got an aging population with low birth rate, and we're not going to keep up with Social Security and tax benefits, and going into Social Security coffers and Medicare coffers. And so then a response has been to just allow proliferation of illegal immigration. 10 million border jumpers in the past few years on the one end, whereas maybe if people just had those babies, then the actual population wouldn't be in such a spot for the economy. But whatever the story is, Americans aren't, we've got but few options. So if Americans don't want to learn the skills, they can have visas. At least it's a step up from the border jumper situation, where these people are going to American universities and they're learning skills from American universities and being integrated into the culture at the university, and so then they could just transition into work at a corporation. And that's going to lead to more social strife, because these people are going to be less fluent in English, and they're certainly not going to be as well versed in the American culture of being drunk and watching football and shouting and toting around guns, the Applebee's and whatnot, and just being proud street protesters and all this stuff. But they might actually go to work and actually do their job inside the company office and develop things scientifically, which will prolong life and help keep the American economy afloat, more so than if we don't have people filling these jobs. And of course, there are disadvantages with brain drain, and the political disruptions are a big thing now. But we've got but few choices. So either Americans can learn to go to school and value education, or we can increase the number of H-1B work visas. That can turn into a more legal immigration to fill the high tech sector and medical field and STEM jobs. Or third option, we can just have a lower productivity and a lesser performing tech sector and STEM field, and then foreign companies and foreign countries will then have a competitive advantage, and either comparatively, proportionally, or in terms of absolute mean value, then the American economy will just sink and slump in comparison to those in foreign countries, which would then resemble our academic performance. So the physical health of the country and the health of the economy is very much represented in the performance of the students, and it has been flat, middling, and decreasing. And uncoincidentally, that's the situation we're in with regard to all these other categories and characteristics of the country, the economy, its people at scale. So we've got but few choices, and as time goes on, time's a ticking, and individuals are going to have to either pick up the charge to lead on to the next thing, or to just become comfortable in not having what they think they want, or change their wants and their needs. But people aren't all that rational, and so this current chaotic situation that we're in is very much a result of years and years and years of failure to address core, mature adult things, and I would like that people start doing that personally. All right, this has been the T. The reading room is now closed.